It started as a harmless getaway. A few days in the wilderness, no phones, no emails, just me and the quiet solace of nature. I'd found the cabin online, an old structure built in the early 1900s, tucked deep into the Appalachians. The pictures showed a rustic charm, weathered wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out over a misty valley. It was perfect, or so I thought. I arrived late in the afternoon, the autumn sun already dipping below the trees. The road leading up to the cabin was little more than a dirt trail, and my car struggled over roots and rocks. When I finally saw it, the place looked even more isolated than I imagined. The forest pressed in on all sides, shadows pooling between the towering pines. The air smelled damp like rain-soaked leaves, and the cabin creaked as I stepped onto the porch. It was colder inside than I expected, and the electricity was unreliable. Dim lights flickered when I flipped the switches, and the fridge hummed like it was on its last legs. But I told myself this was all part of the charm. I spent the first evening unpacking and starting a fire. There were no neighbors, no distant sounds of traffic, just an eerie quiet, broken occasionally by the call of an owl. It wasn't until I climbed into bed that I noticed the first strange thing. The bedroom window faced the woods. As I pulled the curtains shut, I saw faint lights flickering among the trees, like distant lanterns swaying in the dark. My first thought was campers, but who'd be wandering out here so late? Still, I told myself it wasn't my business. I was here for peace, not paranoia. But that night, I didn't sleep well. I woke several times to the sound of creaking wood. At first, I thought it was the cabin settling, but it seemed to move. It started at the far end of the house and slowly crept closer, as if someone, or something, was walking across the floor. When I worked up the courage to check, there was nothing. Just the same cold, empty room. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent the day hiking, following trails that led deeper into the forest. But even in the sunlight, the woods felt wrong. Too quiet. I didn't see a single animal. No squirrels, no birds, not even a bug buzzing by my ear. Just the constant rustle of leaves, as if something unseen was moving alongside me. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The front door was open. I was sure I'd locked it. I hesitated on the porch, my heart pounding, before stepping inside. The air felt heavier, and the smell of damp wood was stronger, almost suffocating. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the noises started again, louder this time. Creaking, scratching, and faint whispers, too low to make out but unmistakably human. I stayed frozen in bed, clutching the blanket like it could protect me. The whispers grew closer, circling the room, and then they stopped. In the silence, I heard the faintest sound. Breathing. Not mine. It was coming from the corner of the room. I didn't dare move, didn't dare look. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually the breathing faded and morning came. I should have left then. I wanted to, but my pride, or maybe my stupidity, kept me there. I convinced myself I was imagining things, that it was just the isolation getting to me. On the third day, I found the carvings. They were etched into the wooden walls of the cabin. Deep grooves that I hadn't noticed before. Strange symbols, crude and jagged, like a child's drawing of a face, round eyes and a wide, toothy grin. They were everywhere. The walls, the floorboards, even the ceiling. And somehow, I knew they hadn't been there when I arrived. I spent the day trying to scrub them away, but they wouldn't budge. It was as if the wood itself had grown them. That night, I barricaded the bedroom door and kept a flashlight clutched in my hand. The noises returned, louder and angrier. The whispers became screams, overlapping voices shrieking in a language I didn't understand. The walls shook, the windows rattled, and the air grew so cold I could see my breath. And then the knocking started. It came from the front door at first, slow, deliberate. I tried to ignore it, but it moved closer, knocking on the walls, the windows, even the roof. I heard footsteps on the porch, heavy and wet, like someone dragging their feet. Then, the worst sound of all, the bedroom doorknob turning. Slowly, carefully. I shone the flashlight at the door, praying it would stay closed. For a moment, it did. But then the knocking started again, on the inside of the room. I screamed, grabbing anything I could use as a weapon, a lamp, a chair, whatever was within reach. The knocking grew frantic, louder and louder until it felt like the entire cabin would collapse. And then, silence. The room was dark, my flashlight flickering. I held my breath, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that I wasn't alone. But all I heard was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. When morning came, I found the cabin door wide open. The carvings on the walls had multiplied, their grinning faces staring at me from every surface, and on the floor, written in ash, were the words, "Leave now." I didn't pack. I didn't think. I just ran. Out the door, into the car, and down that cursed dirt road as fast as it would take me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the forest was nothing more than a shadow in my rearview mirror. I never went back. Never told anyone what happened. Not really. How could I? Who'd believe me? But sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear the knocking. And when I close my eyes, I see those faces, grinning at me from the darkness. And I wonder, did I really escape? Or did something follow me home?
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a weekend of solitude, a chance to clear my mind after a year that had chewed me up and spat me out. I'd found a listing for a remote cabin deep in the Ozarks, secluded, off the grid, and perfect for the kind of soul-searching I thought I needed. But I was wrong. So wrong. The drive up was uneventful, the highway giving way to narrow dirt roads that wound through dense forests. The cabin was even more isolated than I'd imagined, perched on a rocky hill with a view of a murky, still lake below. The air smelled of damp earth and moss, and the trees pressed so close it felt like they were watching me. The cabin itself was old, very old. Its wooden beams were dark and warped, and the windows were streaked with grime. It creaked and groaned as if settling into itself after years of neglect. There was no electricity, just a wood-burning stove and an old oil lamp that cast flickering shadows across the walls. The first day was uneventful. I spent it exploring the area, walking along the shoreline of the lake, and trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just nerves, that I wasn't used to the quiet. But there was something off about the lake. Its surface was too still, like black glass, and the water gave off a faint metallic smell that made my stomach turn. That night, I started to hear the noises. They came as I was lying in bed, staring at the rafters and trying to sleep. At first, it was faint, a soft tapping like rain against the windows. But when I got up to look, there was nothing. The sky was clear, and the forest was deathly silent. I tried to ignore it, but the tapping grew louder, sharper. It moved, coming from the walls, then the ceiling, then the floor. It wasn't random either. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like knocking. I stayed frozen in bed, my heart pounding, until the sound finally stopped just before dawn. The next morning, I found the first set of footprints. They were in the dirt outside the cabin, leading from the tree line to the front porch. They were strange, almost human, but too large, with long, clawed toes that dug deep into the ground. I tried to convince myself they were just animal tracks, but I'd never seen anything like them before. As the day wore on, I felt the forest closing in around me. The air grew heavier, and the shadows stretched longer than they should have. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a flash of white between the trees, a shape darting just out of sight. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time night fell, I was a wreck. I barricaded the doors and windows with furniture and sat by the stove with a flashlight, clutching the oil lamp like a lifeline. The cabin felt wrong, like it was pressing in on me, and the air was filled with the faint smell of rot. That's when I heard it again, the knocking. It started soft, coming from the far wall, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. It moved around the cabin, circling me like a predator stalking its prey. And then I heard something else. Breathing. Slow, wet, and ragged, coming from just outside the window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I edged toward the glass, my heart pounding so hard it hurt, and shone the flashlight into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows. But then it moved. A face, pale, elongated, and twisted into a grotesque grin, emerged from the darkness, its black eyes fixed on me. The skin was stretched tight over its skull, and its mouth was filled with teeth that were too sharp, too many. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The knocking turned to pounding, shaking the cabin as whatever it was tried to force its way inside. I grabbed the oil lamp and ran for the bedroom, slamming the door behind me and pushing the bed against it. The pounding didn't stop. It was everywhere, on the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. And then I heard its voice, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from inside my head. It was speaking in a language I didn't understand, but I could feel its meaning. "Let me in." I screamed, covering my ears and huddling in the corner, but it didn't stop. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were deafening. The air grew colder and the stench of rot filled the room. I thought I was going to die right there, trapped in that cursed cabin. And then, silence. The whispers stopped, the pounding ceased, and all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. I stayed there, shaking and clutching the lamp, until the first rays of sunlight broke through the window. When I finally worked up the courage to leave the bedroom, the cabin was empty. But the door, the heavy wooden door I'd barricaded with everything I could find, was wide open, and carved into the walls in jagged, uneven letters were the words, "You can't hide." I didn't pack. I didn't even put on shoes. I ran out the door, down the hill, and into my car. The dirt road was a blur as I sped away, and I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I never went back to that cabin. I never even tried to find it again. But I know it's still out there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed and the house is quiet, I hear it, the faint sound of tapping on the walls, and I know it's found me again.
Story number 3.
It was a last-minute decision to join the camping trip. My friends Sarah, Jake, and Maya had planned it for weeks, but I'd hesitated. I was never much of a camper, and the idea of staying in a remote, dilapidated cabin deep in the Colorado Rockies didn't exactly thrill me. But Sarah insisted. "It's an adventure," she'd said. "We'll make memories." We arrived late in the afternoon, the four of us crammed into Jake's SUV. The cabin was a relic from the 1800s, used by trappers and miners long before the forests around it had grown thick and wild. It stood alone at the end of a winding dirt trail, its wooden walls weathered and dark. A single window on the second floor stared down at us like a hollow, unblinking eye. "Charming," I muttered as we climbed out of the car. Inside, the cabin was worse. The air was damp and carried a faint, sour odor, like something long dead. The floors creaked with every step, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. An old iron stove sat in the corner of the main room, and a spiral staircase led to the second floor, where 2 small bedrooms waited. "It's not that bad," Jake said, dumping his backpack onto a dusty couch. But something about the place felt wrong. It wasn't just the smell or the creaking floorboards. It was the silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every sound. That first night, we built a fire outside and shared drinks and stories. The forest around us was pitch black, the trees towering like sentinels. As we laughed and talked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see something lurking just beyond the firelight. But there was nothing, just darkness. By the time we headed inside, the temperature had dropped sharply. The cabin felt colder than the air outside, and the musty smell had grown stronger. We decided to sleep in the living room together, the fire in the stove our only source of warmth. I was the last to fall asleep, staring at the flickering shadows on the ceiling. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep, but then I heard it. Faint footsteps upstairs. My heart began to race. I told myself it had to be Jake or Sarah, but when I turned to look, I saw all 3 of them asleep on the floor near me. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the upstairs to the other. I sat up, straining to hear. The floorboards groaned, the sound growing louder as if whatever was upstairs was heading toward the staircase. "Jake?" I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned and opened his eyes, but before I could say anything, the footsteps stopped. "What is it?" he asked, his voice groggy. I thought I heard something upstairs." He frowned, sitting up. Probably just the wind or the house settling. But the house wasn't settling. I knew what I'd heard. The next morning, I found scratches on the walls in the kitchen. Long, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. "Rats, maybe?" Maya said when I showed her. "Rats don't make marks like that," I replied, but she just shrugged. The day was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me, like the forest itself was alive and staring. That night, the real horror began. We decided to sleep upstairs since the bedrooms were slightly warmer. I shared one room with Maya while Sarah and Jake took the other. We'd barely blown out the lantern when the noises started again. At first, it was the same footsteps I'd heard the night before. But then there was something else, a soft rasping sound, like breathing. It was coming from the closet. "Maya," I hissed, shaking her awake. "What?" she mumbled, annoyed. "Listen." She sat up, and as soon as she did, the breathing stopped. "I don't hear anything," she said. "It was coming from the closet." Maya sighed. "You're just freaking yourself out. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. I lay there staring at the closet door, which seemed to loom larger in the dark. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours, and just as I was beginning to relax, the door creaked open. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Something was in there. I could feel it. Maya, I whispered, but she was already asleep again. The door opened wider, and in the faint moonlight, I saw a hand, pale and bony, with impossibly long fingers that curled around the edge of the door. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Slowly, the hand withdrew, and the door creaked shut. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I tried to convince the others to leave, but they just laughed it off. "It's an old cabin," Jake said. "Of course it's creepy." By that evening, the mood had shifted. Maya had found more scratches, this time on the staircase, and Sarah swore she'd seen someone standing at the edge of the woods. "We're leaving tomorrow," Jake said, though he tried to sound confident. That night, we stayed together in the living room, the fire roaring in the stove. No one wanted to sleep upstairs. Around midnight, the noises started again. The footsteps, the scratching, and then the breathing. This time, it wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. It was inside the room with us. The fire flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows, and then we saw it. A figure emerged from the corner of the room, tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its skull. Its eyes were empty sockets, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. We froze, too terrified to move, as it stepped closer. The air grew icy, and the stench of decay filled the room. Jake was the first to react, grabbing a burning log from the stove and swinging it at the thing. But as soon as the fire touched it, the figure vanished, leaving behind nothing but the lingering smell of rot. We didn't wait for morning. We grabbed our bags and ran to the car, speeding down the dirt road as fast as we could. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know what was in that cabin or why it let us leave, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear it again, that soft, rasping breath, and I know it's not over.
Story number 4.
I'd never heard of the cabin until my cousin Ben invited me up for the weekend. He'd inherited it from an uncle neither of us had known well, a reclusive man who'd lived most of his life in the backwoods of Oregon. "It's rustic, but it's peaceful," Ben had said. "You could use a break from the city, right?" I agreed, mostly because I hadn't seen Ben in years, and the idea of escaping my tiny apartment and constant work stress sounded appealing. When I arrived, though, I regretted saying yes almost immediately. The cabin was old, its walls made of dark, weathered wood that seemed to absorb the light. It was surrounded by towering evergreens, so dense they blocked most of the sun. The road leading there was little more than a dirt path, and the nearest town was over an hour away. Inside, the cabin smelled like mildew and stale air. The furniture was mismatched, worn, and coated with a thin layer of dust. There were no modern amenities, no electricity, no running water, just an old wood stove for heat and a well outside for water. "Kind of creepy, huh?" Ben said, noticing my expression. "It's atmospheric," I replied, trying to sound polite. That first night, we sat by the fireplace, drinking whiskey and reminiscing about our childhood. Ben told me about the cabin's previous owner, Uncle Clarence. "He was a strange guy," Ben said, staring into the fire. "Kept to himself, never married, never had kids. Rumor has it he didn't even leave the property for the last 20 years of his life." "What did he do out here all alone?" I asked. Ben shrugged. "Nobody really knows. The neighbors, what few there are, say he got obsessed with something. They'd hear him at night, shouting or chanting. Some of them swore they saw lights in the woods, but people love to gossip." I laughed, but uneasily. The cabin was already giving me the creeps, and Ben's story didn't help. We went to bed late, Ben taking the upstairs loft while I stayed in a small room on the ground floor. The bed was old and lumpy, and I could hear the wind whistling through cracks in the walls. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling until I finally drifted off. I woke sometime in the middle of the night to a strange sound, scratching. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more frantic. It was coming from the other side of the wall near the head of the bed. I froze, my heart pounding. It sounded like claws raking against the wood, and it didn't stop. Gathering my courage, I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shone it at the wall. The sound stopped immediately. I waited, holding my breath, but it didn't start again. Telling myself it was probably just a raccoon or some other animal, I eventually fell back asleep. The next day, I told Ben about it, but he just shrugged. "It's an old cabin in the woods. You'll hear weird stuff." We spent the day hiking, exploring the forest around the cabin. The woods were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. No birds, no animals, just the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional groan of the wind. As we headed back, we passed a small clearing, and something caught my eye. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, arranged in a perfect ring. Inside the circle, the ground was charred, as if there had been a fire. "What do you think that is?" I asked. Ben frowned. "I've seen it before. No idea. Probably just where someone had a bonfire." "Doesn't look like a normal fire pit," I said, shivering despite myself. "Yeah, well, people around here are weird," Ben replied, brushing it off. That night, the scratching came back. This time, it wasn't just in one spot. It was all around the cabin. It sounded like dozens of claws scraping against the wood, circling us. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, sitting up in bed. Ben nodded, his face pale. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the door. "Wait," I hissed, but he was already gone. I sat there, clutching the blanket, listening as the scratching grew louder. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Ben came back a few minutes later, his face tight. "There's nothing out there," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. The next day, things got worse. When we woke up, we found strange symbols carved into the trees around the cabin. Spirals, crosses, and shapes that looked almost like letters, but not in any language I recognized. "Did you do this as a joke?" Ben asked, his voice tense. "What? No. Why would I?" His jaw tightened. Then someone else did. We decided to leave that afternoon. I was ready to go, and even Ben, who had been dismissive of my concerns, seemed shaken. As we packed up, I noticed something on the inside of the front door. There were scratches there too, but they weren't random. They formed the same symbols we'd seen on the trees. "Ben," I called, my voice trembling. He came over, his face going pale when he saw the carvings. "What the hell is this?" "I don't know," I whispered, "but I think we need to go. Now." We grabbed our bags and ran to the car, not bothering to lock the cabin behind us. The drive down the dirt road felt like it took forever, and the entire time I felt like we were being watched. Just as we reached the main road, Ben slammed on the brakes. "What are you doing?" I yelled. He pointed ahead, his hands shaking. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body wrapped in tattered, dark fabric. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could see glowing red eyes staring back at us. "Go!" I screamed. Ben hit the gas, swerving around the figure. As we sped past, I turned to look out the back window and froze. The figure was still there, standing in the road, but now it was grinning. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, back in the safety of town. We never went back to that cabin. I don't know what we encountered in those woods, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about those red eyes. And when I wake up, I swear I can hear scratching on the walls.
Story number 5.
I never should have agreed to house-sit the old cabin. My friend Mark had begged me, saying he and his wife needed a break after their newborn's exhausting first few months. "It's quiet, peaceful," he'd said. "You can write, read, whatever. Just keep an eye on the place." The cabin was tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, miles from any neighbor, with a dense forest pressing close on all sides. It was picturesque by day, but suffocatingly isolated at night. Mark had inherited the place from his grandfather, a man he rarely talked about. That should have been my first red flag. I arrived in the early afternoon. The cabin was simple. One main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom. A ladder led to a loft piled high with boxes. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the only decorations were old black and white photographs of stoic family members and a hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace. Mark had left me detailed instructions, but as I unpacked, I found a note stuck to the fridge. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible. "Do not open the cellar, no matter what you hear." I frowned, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. The cellar door was in the kitchen, bolted shut with a rusty padlock. Curious, I tapped it with my foot, and it echoed hollowly. That night, I built a fire and settled in with a book. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside was warm and calm. For a while, I almost enjoyed the solitude. But around midnight, I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the direction of the cellar. I froze, my heart pounding. At first, I told myself it was just an animal outside, but the scratching grew louder, more insistent, and there was no mistaking the direction. It was coming from below. I crept into the kitchen, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the walls. The scratching stopped the moment I approached the cellar door. My hand hovered over the padlock, but I hesitated, Mark's note echoing in my mind, "Do not open the cellar." Instead, I backed away and returned to the couch, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like unseen eyes were peering at me through the cracks in the walls. The scratching didn't return that night, but I barely slept. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was eerily silent, with no birdsong or rustling leaves, only the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the wind. I found an overgrown path that led to a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient, weathered stone circle, each slab etched with strange, twisting symbols. A chill ran through me as I stepped closer. The air seemed heavier here, and the ground inside the circle was barren, devoid of grass or leaves. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was watching me. I hurried back to the cabin, the oppressive silence of the forest following me the entire way. That night, the noises returned. Not just scratching this time, but faint whispers, low and guttural. They rose and fell like a chant coming from beneath the floorboards. I pressed my ear to the wood, and the sound grew clearer. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I'd ever heard. I bolted upright, grabbing the hunting rifle from above the fireplace. My hands trembled as I checked the lock on the cellar door. It was still secure, but the whispers continued, growing louder, more frenzied. Then they stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a single, loud bang against the door, so hard it rattled the hinges. I stumbled back, clutching the rifle, my breath coming in short gasps. The door didn't move again, but I didn't sleep that night. By the third day, I was ready to leave, but the storm had worsened. The narrow dirt road leading to the cabin was now a river of mud, and my car was stuck. I had no choice but to wait it out. That night, as the storm raged outside, I heard the whispers again. This time, they weren't coming from the cellar. They were coming from the loft. I climbed the ladder slowly, rifle in hand, the whispers growing louder with every step. The loft was filled with old boxes and furniture draped in dusty sheets. In the corner, an antique mirror stood propped against the wall, its silvered surface tarnished and cracked. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, but I couldn't see where they were coming from. Then I noticed the mirror. Its reflection was wrong, showing the room, but distorted, warped as if seen through water. And then I saw it. A figure moved in the reflection, but there was nothing in the room. It was tall and thin, with impossibly long limbs and a face that was little more than a shadow. Its head tilted, as if it was looking at me, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the ladder, and the whispers stopped. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, but I didn't trust it. I threw an old sheet over the mirror and climbed back down, my hands shaking. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the cabin with me. I stayed by the fire, the rifle in my lap, and counted down the hours until daylight. The storm finally let up the next morning, and I didn't waste any time. I packed my things and got my car unstuck, leaving the cabin and whatever was in it behind. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the cabin growing smaller in the distance. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window, watching me. I never told Mark what happened. When he asked how the trip went, I lied, saying it was peaceful. But I can't stop thinking about that note, the cellar, and the figure in the mirror. Sometimes at night I hear whispers. They're faint, almost too quiet to notice, but they're there. And I'm starting to think the cabin wasn't the only thing I left behind.
Story number 6.
I'd been warned not to go. The woods out there aren't like other places, my friend Eric had said. People get lost and sometimes they don't come back. But I didn't listen. When I found the listing for a remote cabin rental deep in the forests of West Virginia, I couldn't resist. I'd been desperate to get away after a nasty breakup, and the idea of solitude sounded perfect. The photos showed a quaint log cabin tucked away from civilization, surrounded by lush greenery. When I arrived, the place looked just as picturesque as advertised, if not more so. The driveway was little more than a gravel path that wound through towering pines. The cabin itself was charming, with a wraparound porch and a small wooden swing. A creek ran nearby, its gentle babbling the only sound besides the rustling leaves. Inside, the cabin was cozy. A stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a loft bedroom. I immediately unpacked, eager to settle in. The air smelled faintly of cedar and pine, and for the first time in months I felt a sense of peace. That night after dinner I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the stars. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and frogs, a soothing symphony that lulled me into a sense of calm. It wasn't until I was heading back inside that I noticed something odd. Near the edge of the porch, where the light from the cabin faded into shadow, there were footprints. They were faint but distinct, bare feet, larger than mine, pressed into the soft dirt. I frowned, trying to make sense of it. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, and I hadn't seen another person since I'd arrived. Maybe it's just an animal, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. That night, I slept fitfully. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and once, what sounded like a faint knock on the cabin's walls. The next morning, I found more footprints. This time, they were closer to the cabin, leading around the side toward the back door. My stomach twisted as I followed them. They ended abruptly near the creek, as if whoever or whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a hiker who'd wandered too far, or a prank by some local kids. But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. That night, I locked every door and window and kept the fire burning. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the cabin felt different now. Heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I fell asleep on the couch, clutching a flashlight. At some point, I woke up. The fire had died down, and the cabin was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. And then I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the window. I froze, my heart pounding. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something standing just outside the glass. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was slow, deliberate, almost patient. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the window. There was nothing there. I rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain, but all I saw was the dark forest, empty and still. The tapping stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I debated leaving, but I'd only rented the cabin for 2 more days, and I didn't want to let my imagination ruin the trip. I decided to spend the day hiking, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The trail near the cabin was overgrown, but it led to a beautiful overlook. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every now and then, I'd hear a twig snap or the crunch of leaves, but when I turned around, the path was empty. When I reached the overlook, I froze. There, on the ground, were more footprints. They weren't mine. These were larger, deeper, and they circled the spot where I stood, as if someone had been waiting for me. My chest tightened, and I hurried back to the cabin, refusing to look behind me. By the time I got back, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked different now, its charm replaced by an ominous stillness. Inside, I locked the doors and windows again, double-checking every latch. I built the fire high and sat with my back to the wall, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. That night, the knocking returned. This time, it wasn't just at the window. It was at the front door, then the back, then the walls themselves. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone or something was testing the boundaries of the cabin. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, heart racing, waiting for it to stop. By morning, the knocking was gone, but when I stepped outside, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the porch, written in the dirt, were words, "Leave." They were scrawled in jagged letters as if made with claws, not fingers. I didn't need any more convincing. I packed my things in record time and got in my car, peeling out of the driveway without a second glance. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the forest, just before the cabin disappeared from view, I saw a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long limbs that stretched like tree branches. Its face was pale and featureless, and its head tilted as if watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never told anyone what happened, not even Eric. But every now and then, I dream about the cabin. I hear the tapping, the knocking, and the whispered word, "Leave." And when I wake up, I always feel like I'm not alone.
Story number 7.
I hadn't been back to my hometown in over a decade, but when my childhood friend Rachel called, saying she needed someone to house-sit her parents' lake cabin, I reluctantly agreed. "It's just for the weekend," she'd said, "and you'll love the place. Peaceful, quiet, great view of the lake." I could have said no, but there was something in Rachel's voice, an edge of desperation, that made me say yes. So on a crisp October afternoon, I drove 3 hours to the outskirts of town, to the old cabin, tucked deep in the woods by Blackwater Lake. The place looked unchanged from my childhood memories. A weathered structure, perched on the edge of the glassy lake, its reflection shimmering in the dark water. The autumn leaves painted the forest in hues of gold and crimson, and for a moment, I almost felt at peace. Rachel left me a list of instructions, where to find the spare key, how to start the generator, and a note that simply read, "Don't go swimming after dark." I laughed when I read it. "Superstitions," I muttered, tossing the note aside. The first day passed uneventfully. I unpacked, made myself a simple dinner, and settled onto the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The lake looked like ink under the fading light, still and silent. But as darkness settled in, the quiet began to feel oppressive. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at the sky. The only sound was the occasional ripple in the water, too faint to be caused by the wind. That night I woke suddenly, unsure of what had stirred me. The clock on the nightstand read 3:12 a.m. At first, everything was silent, but then I heard it, a faint splashing sound coming from the lake. I told myself it was probably a fish or a bird, but curiosity got the better of me. Wrapping a blanket around my shoulders, I stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting at my skin. The lake was still, except for faint ripples near the center, as if something had just disappeared beneath the surface. Then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the water, barely illuminated by the moonlight. It was a woman, her long, dark hair hanging in wet strands over her face. Her pale dress clung to her body, dripping water onto the rocks below. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. "Do you need help?" I tried again, stepping closer. The woman raised her head, and for a moment I thought I saw her smile. A wide, unnatural grin that sent a chill down my spine. Then she turned and walked into the lake, disappearing beneath the surface without a ripple. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Was it a prank? A trick of the light? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to explore the lake's edge. The sun was bright, chasing away the shadows, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I reached the water, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, bare, wet, leading from the lake to the rocks where I'd seen the figure. They ended abruptly, as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. I tried to shake off the unease, but the rest of the day felt wrong. The cabin seemed darker, colder, and the forest around it felt too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. That night I kept all the lights on and tried to distract myself with a book, but the words blurred together. Every little creak of the cabin made me jump, and I couldn't stop glancing at the windows, half expecting to see her face staring back at me. Around midnight, the power went out. I froze, clutching my flashlight, listening to the sudden, deafening silence. Then, faintly, I heard it again. The splashing. This time, it was louder, closer. Against every instinct, I crept to the window and peered out. The moon was hidden behind clouds, but I could just make out a shape in the water, a head bobbing up and down. As I watched, the figure began moving toward the cabin, the water barely rippling around it. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hands. The splashing grew louder, closer, until it stopped altogether. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. Knock, knock. I held my breath, willing it to go away. Knock, knock, knock. The doorknob rattled, and I nearly screamed. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no answer, just the sound of water dripping onto the porch. I backed away, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The knocking stopped, but a new sound took its place, a wet, slithering noise like something crawling across the wood. The noise circled the cabin, moving from window to window, until it stopped outside the one nearest to me. I couldn't help myself. I looked. The woman was there, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide and unblinking, her grin stretching impossibly wide. She mouthed something, but I couldn't make out the words. Then, slowly, she raised one hand and pointed toward the lake. I stumbled back, tripping over the rug and landing hard on the floor. When I looked again, she was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning finally came, I threw my things into my bag and left without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the road. Instead, I saw the lake, calm and still, its surface reflecting the sky. But just as I rounded the bend, I saw it, a single ripple in the water, moving toward the shore.
Story number 8.
When my uncle passed away, I inherited his house. It wasn't much to look at, an old, creaking farmhouse on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town. The locals called it Hollis House, and not fondly. The name seemed to carry weight, as if it were something people didn't like to think about for too long. I'd been to the house once as a child, though I barely remembered it. Uncle Robert was a recluse, a man who lived on the edge of society, both literally and figuratively. His death wasn't unexpected, but inheriting the house caught me off guard. I wasn't in the best financial place, so I decided to fix it up and sell it. A weekend trip to assess the damage didn't seem like a big deal. The house was worse than I remembered. Peeling paint, broken windows, and a roof that looked ready to collapse. The air inside was musty, heavy, and smelled faintly of rot. The first night, I stayed in the living room, too uneasy to venture deeper into the house. I found an old oil lamp and a pile of musty blankets settling into a worn-out armchair. It was quiet. Too quiet. Even in the middle of the night, there were no sounds of crickets or distant cars, just an oppressive silence. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound I couldn't immediately place. It was faint at first, like the creak of a door or the shuffle of footsteps. Probably just the house settling, I told myself, though the explanation didn't feel right. The noise continued, irregular and soft, like someone walking barefoot on wooden floors. I held my breath, listening. It seemed to come from the floor above me. I tried to ignore it, but sleep was impossible. Every time I started to drift off, the sound returned, growing louder, closer. By dawn, I was exhausted but determined to shake off the fear. It was an old house, after all. Old houses made noises. The second day was spent exploring the house. Most of it was dusty and decayed, filled with old furniture and forgotten possessions. But the upstairs, it felt different. At the end of the hallway was a locked door. The handle was cold and refused to budge, and though I searched the house, I couldn't find the key. That night, the noises returned. This time, they started earlier. The creaks and shuffles were joined by faint whispers, so soft I couldn't make out the words. I lit the oil lamp and sat in the armchair, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a door opening. I froze, clutching the blanket around me as the whispers grew louder. Footsteps echoed down the stairs, deliberate and heavy, but no one appeared. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the third day, I was ready to leave, but a storm rolled in, turning the dirt road into a river of mud. I was trapped. The power went out that evening, leaving me with only the oil lamp and the storm's howling wind. I tried to stay calm, but as the night deepened, the noises returned. More insistent, more real. The footsteps started on the second floor, moving toward the locked door. Then came the knocking. It was slow and deliberate, 3 sharp raps, as if someone or something wanted to be let out. I clenched my fists, trying to ignore it, but the knocking grew louder, more forceful. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty house. The knocking stopped, and for a moment I thought it was over. Then I heard it. A voice, hoarse and cold, whispering from the other side of the door. "Let me out." I bolted down the stairs, clutching the oil lamp, and locked myself in the living room. The knocking didn't follow me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the room in brief, blinding flashes. In one of those flashes, I saw it. A figure standing in the corner. It was tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow, but its eyes gleamed like wet stones. I screamed, stumbling backward and dropping the lamp. The oil spilled, flames licking at the floorboards. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, as if it were waiting for something. Panicking, I grabbed a blanket and smothered the flames, choking on smoke and fear. When I looked up, the figure was gone, but the whispers remained. They seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, the floors, the very air around me. Let me out. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing the heaviest object I could find, I ran upstairs and smashed the lock on the door. It swung open with a groan, revealing a room that didn't make sense. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a distorted version of the room. In the center stood a wooden chair, its surface scratched and splintered as if someone had clawed at it for years. And then I saw her. A woman sat in the chair, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Her eyes locked onto mine, and she began to laugh, a high, manic sound that echoed through the room. I stumbled back, tripping over the threshold. When I looked again, the room was empty, but I could still hear the laughter. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. When the storm cleared, I left the house without looking back. I never told anyone what happened, but sometimes late at night, I hear the whispers again. They always say the same thing. Let me out.
Story number 9.
They called it the Devil's Ridge, a jagged stretch of Appalachian wilderness with a history of disappearances, strange deaths, and whispered legends. I didn't believe in any of it when I first heard the stories. I thought they were just local folklore, designed to keep outsiders away. I wasn't an outsider, though. I'd grown up in the nearby town of Ash Hollow. After leaving for college, I rarely came back, but when my father passed away, I had no choice but to return. He left me his old hunting cabin, perched on the edge of the ridge. The cabin hadn't been used in years, and I decided to spend a few days cleaning it out before putting it up for sale. It seemed like an easy enough task, though the locals gave me strange looks when I mentioned where I was going. Be careful out there, one old man warned me at the gas station. The ridge doesn't like strangers. I brushed off his warning and drove up the winding mountain road, the forest growing denser and darker with each mile. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the clearing. The cabin was smaller than I remembered, its wooden walls weathered and gray. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. I set about tidying up, opening windows and sweeping the floors, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That first night, I slept uneasily. The forest around the cabin was eerily quiet. No rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals, just silence. Around midnight, I woke to a noise. It was faint at first, like a low hum, but it grew louder, rising and falling in a strange, unnatural rhythm. I got out of bed and peered out the window. The forest was dark, but I could just make out movement among the trees, shadows shifting and swaying as if caught in some unseen current. I told myself it was the wind and went back to bed, though it took hours to fall asleep. The next morning, I found strange markings around the cabin. They were carved into the trees, deep and precise, forming symbols I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it might be vandalism, but the carvings didn't look fresh. They were old, the grooves darkened and moss-covered, as if they'd been there for decades. I tried to ignore them, focusing on cleaning out the cabin, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The shadows in the forest seemed to move when I wasn't looking, and once, when I stepped outside, I swore I heard someone whisper my name. That night, the humming returned. This time, it was louder, vibrating through the cabin like a distant chant. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, determined to find the source of the noise. The forest was pitch black, the beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The humming seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, growing louder as I moved toward the tree line. Then I saw them. Figures standing in the woods, their shapes barely discernible in the dim light. They were tall and gaunt, their bodies unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for their frames. Their faces were pale and featureless, like blank masks, and they swayed in unison, as if caught in the same rhythm as the humming. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and dropped the flashlight. The beam flickered as it hit the ground, casting erratic shadows across the forest floor. When I looked up, the figures were gone. I ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was a hallucination, maybe caused by stress or lack of sleep, but deep down, I knew better. The humming continued through the night, a constant, droning presence that seeped into my bones. By dawn, I was ready to leave. I packed my things in a hurry and threw them into the truck, but when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over. Panic set in as I tried again and again, but the truck refused to start. I was stranded. That evening, the forest came alive. It started with the humming, louder than ever, followed by whispers that seemed to come from inside the cabin itself. I barricaded the door and windows, clutching a knife as the sounds grew closer. Then came the knocking. It was slow and deliberate, a heavy, echoing sound that rattled the cabin walls. I stayed silent, hoping whoever or whatever was outside would go away. But the knocking continued, steady and unrelenting. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I moved to the window, peeking through a crack in the curtains. The figures were there, standing in a circle around the cabin. They weren't swaying anymore. They were perfectly still, their blank faces turned toward me. One of them stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette on tangled strings. It raised a hand, pressing it against the window pane. Its fingers were impossibly long, tipped with blackened claws that screeched against the glass. "Leave," it rasped, its voice a guttural whisper that seemed to echo inside my head. "I'm trying," I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head as if studying me. Then it stepped back, joining the others. The circle began to sway again, their movements slow and rhythmic as the humming rose to a deafening pitch. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The forest fell silent and the figures were gone. I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, the truck started without issue as if nothing had happened. I drove away as fast as I could, the cabin growing smaller in the rearview mirror. But the ridge wasn't done with me. As I reached the main road, I glanced at the tree line one last time. The figures were there, standing in the shadows, watching me leave, and in the distance I thought I heard the hum start again.